Welcome to another episode in the Law Rapport, episode 29. Today I would like to answer the question being if there is any legal requirement for residents of the Turks and Caicos Islands to carry around identification at all times. My short answer to that is, of course not. We are not living in the Soviet Union in the 1970s and 80s. We are not living in North Korea or China. We are not living in a 24-hour surveillance state. We are living in a modern, progressive Turks and Caicos Islands. Before I dive into the discussions, my usual disclaimer: this is not legal advice. Should not be construed as legal advice. For legal advice, please contact a lawyer of your choice. Welcome back. I have perused very carefully the Immigration Ordinance, and I can find no instance where there's a requirement in the said ordinance that residents of the Turks and Caicos Islands are required by law to carry around identification at all times. I've looked at section 51 of the Immigration Ordinance, which says that an immigration officer may examine a person whom he reasonably suspect of having entered the islands unlawfully or of being in the islands in breach of any conditions or restrictions of his permit to enter or reside in the islands. I've looked at section 109 of the Immigration Ordinance, which gives immigration officer the powers as police officers when conducting an investigation under the ordinance. I've looked at section 110 of the ordinance, which bestowed the powers of arrest on immigration officers. But nowhere in the ordinance is there a legal requirement that residents should be carrying around identification at all times. And if that was so, in my respectful submission, it would have been an undue and unnecessary burden. It would have been tantamount to being living in a police state. Nevertheless, question has been raised repeatedly following the decision of the Supreme Court in the case of the Tuberfields, where they subsequently sued the government and was awarded damages amounting to $45,000 collectively. And I came across an article on the Sun newspaper website in the current affairs column, and it asks practically the same questions. The article is entitled "No Legal Requirement for Residents to Have Identification or Proof of Status at All Times." The article was published on June the 14th, 2022, and it referenced the case of the Tuberfields. The article went on to indicate that the editor-in-chief of the Sun newspaper, Mr. Hayden Boyce, contacted the lawyer for the Tuberfields, Mr. Peter McKnight, and apparently posed the same question to the lawyer, and Mr. McKnight answered, there is no such requirement that you must have proof of status identification with you at all times. During the trial, the Crown was unable to identify any such legal requirement. Then it appears that the newspaper contacted former Minister of Immigration and Attorney at Law, Mr. Dan Gardner, and quoting from the Sun, former Minister of Immigration and Attorney at Law Dan Gardner told the Sun that only work permit holders are required to have their permits and them at all times. This notion that you must have identification on you at all times is an absolute myth, Gardner said. That law only applies to work permit holders, but if you have any other status in the country, you are not required to have any identification with you at all times, not even your driver's license. And if you don't have your driver's license on you, when asked by the police to produce it, the police must give you no less than 3 days to produce it. Gardner noted that in some other countries it is mandatory for vehicle drivers to have their licenses with them, but that is not the case in the Turks and Caicos Islands. I fully endorse the sentiments expressed by Attorney at Law Dan Gardner. The Sun also contacted Attorney at Law Miss Lara Maroof Mizik, and I will read her response according to the article. Lara Maroof Mizik said that under the law, immigration officers must have reasonable grounds to demand that you produce identification or proof of status. They must have grounds to suspect that you have entered the country illegally or that you are an overstayer in the country. But there is no power under the Immigration Ordinance that says persons are mandated to show their status. Immigration officers seem to believe that they are entitled to ask anyone at any time to produce their papers. But I have shown them the ordinance and they have admitted that it isn't there. We are not a police state. We are not a country that mandates people to walk around with documents, she added. Again, I endorse the sentiments expressed by Attorney at Law Maroof Mizik. It is my respectful view that pursuant to the ordinance, an immigration officer must have reasonable grounds for suspecting that you have committed an offense under the Immigration Ordinance, and it is only upon having reasonable grounds that the immigration officer can require a person to produce any documents relating to their status. And the officer, the immigration officer, cannot keep that suspicion a secret. They must inform that person why they are suspecting them, why they believe that they have committed an offense under the ordinance. They cannot just willy-nilly go wrong and say to persons, I believe that you are illegal and I'm taking you to the immigration detention center until you could produce your documents. They must have a reasonable ground. The ordinance places the warden and the immigration officer to have a reasonable ground to suspect that the person has entered the Turks and Caicos Islands unlawfully, or the person is in the Turks and Caicos Islands in breach of any of the conditions or restrictions on which he was permitted to reside in the islands. Here is where I will leave it for today. If you have any comment, please leave it in the comments section below. I thank you for watching, and I will see you in another episode.